They didn't expect me to arrive. Shame, they believed, might keep me away. I spent nearly an hour staring at the invitation. Hour. Like it had no idea what it was carrying. It perched on the metal desk. An embossed white envelope. Edges. My entire name printed. Rebecca Cole. Lieutenant Jen. Whoever spoke. They obviously didn't realize that I hadn't been Rebecca to this family for years, therefore it must have done so from a list. I instantly knew what was inside, even if the back seal wasn't broken yet. I had heard rumors and an email suggesting, came to my help, and an old classmate's casual remark, but it wasn't genuine till that point. Haley was beginning to. Not only was she married, but she was also getting married to Major Andrew Foster. It was almost surgical in its cynicism. 6 years. That's how. My mother's voice has not crossed state boundaries to locate me in a long time, nor a funeral, nor a birthday. When I almost lost my hearing on the second deployment. Nothing but quiet, and now this. This tasteful little rib punch was delivered without passion or affection, but one. Behave is the word in that well-known script. Stuttgart's base was abnormally silent. That afternoon, the flagpole outside my quarters creaked in defiance as the wind pushed against it. The sterility of discipline that I had become accustomed to was present in the room. A bed made of steel, a closed trunk with items no one would touch, and a line of pressed uniforms. In my hands, I flipped the invitation over, as though it might change form. The double rap was sharp when the knock came. He went in without waiting. He looked at the envelope I heard and replied, generator. He had, of course. Simmons possessed radar-like ears, and Granite's patience. Without asking, he sat down. Although we didn't discuss personal issues much, he had known me because I was a young captain who lacked trust and had too much grit. You going? He inquired. I didn't respond. I passed the invitation over the table instead. Squinting at the gold letters, he took it up and let out a breath through his nose. He murmured, Foster, almost to himself. That's the kid you pulled out of a crater in Helmand, right? One, I said. I clipped my voice steadily. Simmons reclined in his seat. Since you rescued his life, he's getting married to your sister. There was nothing unpleasant about our stillness. Like everything else in my life, it was familiar. Life. It was more than just a sound. Simmons refrained from prying. He did nothing except wait. You believe I ought to go? Finally, I asked. He looked at me for a moment. It depends. Will you be burying a ghost, or fighting a war? I chuckled. Not the weightlifting variety, but the kind that can identify a scar. Just watch one burn, perhaps. He didn't grin, then leave. However, avoid wearing your armor is like stars. Wear them as if they were memories. Don't forget who you were without them. His remarks lingered in my mind long after he went out. I put the invitation back on my desk and proceeded to the small window that provided a view of the training field. An excited, boisterous, and ignorant new class of recruits was doing drills. For a while I envied them. The agony was jolted by a burst of wind. Someone cried back, Sir, yes sir, as a drill sergeant below gave an instruction, with the sort of blind fire. After I had long ago died, I went to the closet and removed my dress uniform, which I hadn't worn since the funeral at which I was unable to speak. I smoothed the sleeves like old sores and lay it flat on the bed. The memory of that day was more vivid than I had anticipated. My father had been buried with full honors, Band 21 gun, Marine Corps. Salute? However, nobody reserved a front row seat for me. My mom sat in between Haley and Uncle Roy, with her lips squeezed in that cruel, biting line. When she came without looking up, Haley had given me a quick, inscrutable look before returning her attention to the ceremony as though I were just an out-of-place uniform. I remained the whole time. Later, Barbara Cole had touched my forearm with one hand, and he replied, You shouldn't have come in uniform. It makes it look like you're trying to upstage the family. He replied, Family. I recalled simply leaving without saying anything. I hadn't turned either, ever since. 6 years and 2 continents later I found myself hosting a wedding. Invitation that disguises duty as a desire for reconciliation. Foster Andrew. The marriage wasn't the only thing that hurt. He was, of all people, binding himself to the woman who had previously revealed me on record. No less. That the Cole name was tarnished by me. I recalled the Helmand night, the blast, the twisted steel and dust. Andrew almost lost his leg. I had slithered over an open earth to get to him. I had shrapnel in my shoulder and blood in my mouth. I still had scar. I owe you was the last thing he said before being taken out. And now, Haley was his bride. I took a seat and turned on my laptop. Flight timetables. Virginia's Richmond. Frankfurt is one stop. Red-eye Quiet Anonymous was my choice. I didn't let base command know. Not even my driver knew. After 30 seconds, the ticket confirmation arrived in my mailbox. Later, I wasn't there to be greeted. For the first time in years, I went to be seen. I dragged Andrew away 3 years ago. From a live minefield, Foster. He'll wed the lady who ruined me in 2 weeks. Irony seeped out like sweat through the past. I could still hear it. The sharp inhale before, the brittle snap of static through my calms. Someone said in a whisper, "Shit, that's a mine." My own voice then sounded sharper than I remembered. "Stay put." Andrew stopped. Dust adhered to his body. He had walked on a metal plate. It was partially uncovered beneath the earth. He was afraid to breathe. I didn't either. 10 feet of open hell separated us as we gazed at one another. During that period of quiet, we exchanged an unspoken message. He was aware of his death, and I refused to allow that to occur. I can't recall the agony, only the crawl elbows are grinding, and to gravel, ash tasting with each breath. I used my fingertips to disarm it. Was unable to stop shaking. Andrew sobbed as it snapped out of armed mode. Silently. In the report, I made no mention of it. I was now seated in Lufthansa 3C, trip from Stuttgart to Dallas, gazing up at a sky that seemed too gentle to be part of my imagination. It was empty next to me. To ensure that, I had paid more. When the flight attendant noticed the ribbons on my blouse, I was offered champagne by her. I requested water. Somewhere in I closed my eyes. Atlantic. I couldn't sleep, but I had to ignore the weight of what I was hurtling toward. Or something more familiar. Something more difficult than warfare. Family. The aircraft touched down. 20 minutes early. Dulles had a fresh wax and hand sanitizer odor. Went past customs without any problems. I had no trouble getting my military ID approved. My phone vibrated as soon as I entered the arrivals hall. Unknown figure. I nearly let the phone ring. Spite. Then curiosity prevailed. "Hi there." Even my voice was unintelligible. Well, you did show up." Haley was the one. She still spoke in the same tone. However, very subtle sweetness on top of a metal core. She had the ability to turn a compliment into an accusation. I didn't claim to. I responded, already making my way to the escalator. "Coming to celebrate." She added, "You didn't say anything for 6 years." Brilliantly. Thus this is a step forward. Her tone was devoid of apology. Not even a moment's doubt. "I arrived since I was invited," I said. "Correct. Because your mother coerced you into doing it." I didn't respond. Pause. She chirped after that. "Andrew is excited to see you though. Both of you had chemistry from the beginning." On the moving walkway I halted in the middle of my step. "It's not amusing," she said. I didn't mean it to be. However, her speech carried a smile that I could hear. The identical one she utilized when she informed instructors that I was going through a phase. I danced at school. That same carefully manicured innocence that concealed her claws. "Did I just ask that? I wanted to confirm that you weren't showing up." "Up in full uniform. It's not a holiday." I hung up without answering. Virginia was flowering in early April outside. The route to Alexandria passed through dog-filled neighborhoods, cherry blossoms and woodlands. The sidewalks had just been swept, and the streets were spotless. It appeared to be a postcard sent to demonstrate how wonderful life was. I chose not to use the freeway. I allowed the vehicle to pass. Back when I was still Becky, I used to ride my bike down these side streets. When skinned pride and bloodied knees were the worst wounds I had. When I turned into the cul-de-sac where my mother lives, I saw Mrs. Langford, the neighbor with eyes that saw too much, and hydrangeas were clipped by Everp. She was giving her water. Garden. A hose, coiling at her feet like a question mark. She tilted her head and stared toward the car. "Rebecca?" She gave a call. I put my duffel on one shoulder and stepped outside. She blinked and said, "Hi, Mrs. Langford." "All right." I grinned, without revealing my teeth. "Goodness, you're still in the military." "Yes." She nodded slowly, her gaze following my bars, my posture, and my silence, "Ma'am. You know, I thought you might have departed following everything." I said, "Some of us stay," and left her hedges without waiting for a response. The mansion was just as I recalled it to be. Too flawless, too well-maintained, and too phonily silent. The shutters were recently. The driveway is clean, painted, and shows no signs of deterioration. The porch light was the only one that flickered, as though even electricity was holding its breath. I rang the bell. There was a pause, followed by footsteps. The fragrance hit me immediately as the door opened. My mom's lemon polish signature. The entire house had been cleaned until it was shining with rejection. Barbara was wearing a pearl-cold blouse and beige pants. Her hair was drawn taut with not a single thread missing. My outfit drew her attention. Our quiet grew thicker. "Don't spoil this for Haley, please. They used to say it was rude of me to be silent. They now refer to it as handy." Nothing had changed in the dining room. Not the buzzing of stress, not the china, not the chandelier. Below the table of polished mahogany. One battlefield, 15 seats and 14 bodies, masquerading as a family get-together. I watched them for a moment just inside the doorway. Barbara darted from. She folds napkins and wine glasses as if she were getting ready for a royal reception. The small gold anchors in her earrings caught the light. Homage to my dad's military service. Haley was wearing a silk blouse and was already immaculate. Our cousin Grant just said something that made us laugh too much. Although he lacked humor, he was endearing enough that only I noticed. I took note of everything. My chair was ready at the distant end. Not next to Haley, not even in the center, where I could be seen. The family pictures that will undoubtedly be taken later. Actually, mine was beside the sideboard, where the kitchen's heat brushed the barely made it to the back of my neck, and the talk. I took the chair out. It made a creaking sound. Haley held up her glass. Barbara added, glancing at me, possibly, as she said, family, she announced to new beginnings. Through me, Uncle Dean addressed Major Foster and the future wife. Not mention of me. No, Rebecca's back. No introduction. Lieutenant General Cole is not present. From Germany. Simply empty space where recognition ought to have been. I drank some water. The wine wasn't not yet reached me. Perhaps it wouldn't. The ex-colonel seated close to Barbara. When Wilkins' eyes met mine, I imagined he furrowed his brow. Half to himself, he murmured, "You look familiar." Barbara swiftly leaned in. "Oh, Rebecca. She has been deployed abroad performing security work." The statement struck like a smack wrapped in banter. "Safety." Haley smiled as she addressed the detail. "I'm sure she guards important doors." A couple of giggles drifted around the table. They stayed away from me. I dropped my gaze to the cutlery. A fork for salad. Dessert spoon. A knife sharp enough for appearance, but too dull to draw blood. I didn't remain silent out of submission. It had never been, but silence had always been viewed as a threat in this home, with this family. Wilkins's head cocked, eyes narrowing once more. "Hold on a second. Afghanistan, 2012, phobe comma." I remained motionless. "Indeed, I'm sir." He opened his lips as if to speak, then shut it again. Regarded Barbara. She shook her head in the slightest way. He returned his attention to his plate. Naturally, I allowed the silence to deepen between throat clearing and spoon clinks. I was not questioned by anyone. One took a moment to add me. I might have appeared as a stylish ghost, but even a ghost chills you. At last, the waiter brought the wine to my end of the table. I silently accepted the glass. Haley turned to face me, her eyes sparkling with performance joy. "How long will you be here for, Becky, then? Or are you available to watch over something like a missile silo?" Smile spread over the table. I sipped, waited for it to settle, and then put the glass down. Slowly, I said in a cool, collected voice, "The people I protect are more important than this whole room." Silence blossomed. Not quiet, not furious, yet loud. The chandelier appeared to hold its breath as well. No. Someone chuckled. They were scared because, for the first time, they were unsure of where to put me. I didn't have my name on the seating arrangement. My title wasn't either. Inside, it was printed on thick pearl card paper that was spread out on a metal easel. The entryway of the church. Name by name. Table by table. Additionally, as I looked down, I couldn't find any previous neighbors or cousins. +1. No, Rebecca. Just stillness in a flowery font. No General Cole. I lingered there longer than I intended to, observing as other visitors walked by me, chatting, adjusting corrages, and brushing unseen lapel lint. Reaching around me, a woman wearing lavender heels tapped the board. "Table 8. Close to the stage." She gave her buddy a squeal. "That's pretty close." I took another look. Bottom of table 12. Corner, close to the emergency and fire exits. Naturally, Barbara had. That morning, she gave me a plate of fruit that I hadn't requested and acknowledged it casually, as if it were an afterthought. "You'll out of sight for everyone's benefit, at table 12. She hadn't waited for me to do anything. Answer. I was wearing a dress with blue ribbons, my hair straight and pinned with, standing like a statue in the church's foyer with military precision, attempting to avoid calculating how purposefully I'd been positioned on the edges. I'll give them credit for the church's beauty. The altar was framed by white lilies, gentle. From the speakers came the sound of violin strings. A woman wearing a headset made surgical adjustments to pew ribbons. Soft blues and golds shone in stained glass. Everything was carefully planned and managed. I didn't participate in the curation. Barbara came up beside him. A swish of trained warmth and soft beige. "You do a good job cleaning," she said, looking at my medals as if they were going to discolor the air. "Just keep in mind that there is no press. If someone inquires about what you do, pretend to be in logistics." I gazed at her. "Brigades are under my command." She raised her head a little. "Additionally, you are a guest here." I was about to respond when a photographer walked by the camera. Clicking. He paused, gave me a quick glance, and then turned to photograph a group. Picture of 3 bridesmaids and Haley laughing. There was no swing back of the lens. One of the ushers said, "Cold in here, huh?" Behind me. He laughed and repositioned his cufflinks. "Or perhaps it's just the mother of the bride." Remained silent. The ceremony was efficient and short. Haley's white outfit never asked a question. Beside her, Andrew was inscrutable, polished, and respectable. Once he looked around the pews. When his eyes met mine, I paused. He simply glanced without grinning or nodding, then turned aside. The woman who pulled his bleeding body from a minefield went unnoticed. It seems that wasn't a section of the fairy tale. I stood out of habit when the priest invited members of my immediate family to stand for the blessing. More instinct than will. But before I could move, Barbara's hand was there. Softly, as if she were easing a crease in my jacket, she held her fingers just below my elbow, her just above breath. "Let's avoid confusion," she remarked. Haley's days today. Glanced up at the aisle, then down at her hand. Andrew and Haley were kneeling with their heads down. A line of relatives surrounded them. I had the option to move forward. I couldn't have been stopped. However, wasn't the purpose. The fact that they thought I didn't belong was the main point. I took a seat. Something poignant was started by the violinist. Visitors wiped their eyes. The flash bulbs flickered. During the reception, my table was next to a catering door, nestled behind a pillar. Appeared on the place card, Cole in a tiny typeface. No status. One of the napkins was slightly paler than the rest. Perhaps a message or an accident. A server filled the cups with wine. Passed by me, but omitted mine. I didn't correct him when he looked at his list and stated, "Oh, non-drinking guest." From the other side of the room, Haley, like a candle flame, it drifted. She kissed, twirled in white, and posed for pictures. Cheeks and gave people intense hugs that only ever felt like a possession. With one hand loosely curled around his glass, Andrew maintained the other on her lower back. He never gave me another look. A woman once inquired as to if I was employed with the venue's security. "Yes," I told her. The toast then started. Barbara held out her glass, to be devoted and to love. "This family has 2 top priorities." The room gave a courteous laugh. Haley smiled. Andrew moved his weight. I poured myself a glass of wine and took a drink. It tasted hollow and pricey. That's when I realized, didn't consider me family, but they were going to find out how much of a family I am. She only serves as a gatekeeper. Would desire her. Speaking into the microphone, my sister remarked. Everyone in the room chuckled. It was no soft laugh. It was that kind of sharp, a slicing laugh that reverberates. The kind that stays around too long. The type of music I heard it. I wasn't supposed to be aware that there were locker rooms behind locked doors, centered around dining tables. This one was simply superior, more costly wine and illumination. Under the chandeliers, Haley stood in the middle of the ballroom, beaming. Her gown glistened as though it had been custom-tailored for her. She carried a champagne flute in one hand and the microphone in the other holding a crown and scepter in a queenly balance. Everyone was watching her. That was her life's work. "To think," she said, charmingly looking around the room. "My big sister came here tonight, coming all the way from wherever she is. Stationed now." She smiled and turned slightly to face my table, guarding doorways for grandeur. Everyone gave a round. More laughing, a few courteous remarks, and a round of applause for the silent century in our lives. Claps. While a couple of visitors shuffled uneasily, the majority simply grinned and lifted their from her table, her glasses. Unaware, or worse, complicit. Barbara added, "She is the embarrassment of this family." but at least she made it on with her authoritative, sharp voice. Time. The room tipped with laughter. I got up, not hastily, not hurried, in rage, but gradually, calmly, as if something unavoidable were coming to pass. Andrew was already observing me. He had not grinned or laughed, simply seen like one might observe a storm building over placid waters. Haley's smile wavered for a brief moment. Just, "Oh, come on," she said, laughing. "It's a joke," before raising the microphone once more. "Relax, Rebecca. You always took everything." With deliberate action, without hesitation or haste, Andrew took a step forward. Utensils stopped in mid-sentence. The conversation halted, and each photographer turned their camera, capturing. He moved through the room, past the tables of the academy and former commanders, in a scene they hadn't planned. Every stride seemed to reverberate as he passed by friends and distant cousins dressed in fitted clothes. He halted at one step from me and saluted a sharp, clear, exact military salute, the type you wouldn't offer to a friend, sibling. "Humor. Please pardon my wife," ma'am, Andrew remarked in a steady, clear voice. With the salute still in place, he turned to face the room and announced, "This is Major General." My commanding officer, Rebecca Cole, made audible gasps rather than whispers, as though all of the tuxedos in that room just lost their starch. I did. Haley shifted in her position, the microphone slipping out of her hands and hitting the ground with a hollow thump. Stepped back, mouth widening, eyes wild, and passed out. Barbara jumped up suddenly, toppling a flute of "Rebecca," she began, but the word crumbled into a frantic gasp. "Champagne." They didn't talk, not because they were unsure of what to say, and I didn't even blink. The ballroom caught its breath as if it had swallowed a curse, but every syllable would confess what they had done. Landmine. Quietness clung to the walls, trapped in the folds of the tablecloth made of linen, sunk into each unopened champagne flute. The orchestra had paused in the middle of melody. Guests blinked as if they had forgotten how, and forks hovered in midair. Andrew was standing as well. His salute was complete, and his hand was now lowered. A statement had been made, not a gesture or a plea. A truth etched into his side fingers, steadfast, spine straight. Major General Rebecca Cole. It had been years since anyone had mentioned my name in that room. Not like that. Not with weight. With respect. Barbara's hand gestured for a napkin, which slipped from her lap and fell to the ground. She whispered it to the ground, her eyes darting without bending to pick it up. Haley sat fairly distantly from me, looking for a spot to land some shade, some denial, any departure, but there was none. Sank into her chair, her eyes locked wide and her face pale as if reality hadn't joined her body yet. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Now the woman who recently entertained 100 people and who planned an entire evening around her image appeared to be a youngster surrounded by an object too big to identify. No one moved, until someone did. From the moment a man in a navy blazer stood slowly among the row of tables past the wine bar beside the carved ice swan. Colonel Ritterin, retired. He had led the 73rd Engineering Battalion when I was a lieutenant, but he was still sharp around the edges. Had something to prove and dirt in my teeth. His shoulders squatted as he lifted his right hand in a tight, thoughtful salute. The atmosphere grew heavier. General Park, who once spoke at West Point. Next came a third, a 50-something woman, whose name escaped me but whose body language revealed who she was. Not ostentatious, but Army once, career, and then a fourth. 4 salutes. Not practiced. Simply a silent nod that cut through the evening's courteous veneer. Found her voice at last. Her voice did not begin to tremble under the surface strain at this point. But no. I turned to face her, and she was staring at me, not because I had requested them, not because I insisted on them, but rather because every thread in the room that had been rethreaded pointed here. People mumbled to themselves. Is this the same woman? Feeling the weight of it pushing in the discomfort, the embarrassment, and the recalibration. They were all doing mental rewrites in an attempt to save some, when Haley teasingly said, "The one we dismissed." Someone who hadn't laughed 2 minutes prior. Andrew stepped back, allowing me the floor without. I never spoke. I didn't move. I didn't grab the microphone. I didn't lift my. I merely stood there, and that was plenty to cause them to tremble. I nearly didn't recognize my middle name when my mother eventually addressed me by it. "Ela," she whispered quietly, like if she were evaluating the word's reception. "Is it possible for us to speak?" The hotel lounge was where we were. Set aside for elite visitors who favored whispers over crowds, the space was decorated with velvet shadows and frigid silence of cash. Our table was illuminated by a solitary lamp, and the coffee we shared had. She hadn't referred to me as anything other than your sister's sibling or you for more than 10 years, and it smelt burnt. I didn't correct her. Instead, I waited as she abruptly reached for warmth that she hadn't earned. Her stance was faultless, her pearls were flawless, and she flicked her wrist to straighten her top, but the edge, her voice had grown slack. She was here to spin, not to chastise. She said, definitely made a statement. I didn't respond. She provided a The media is raving about her smile, which she utilized for press pictures and church potlucks. I remained silent despite the fact that not all of it was flattering. She tapped her fingernails on the porcelain cup. Rebecca, nobody was ready for that moment, not even you. I asked calmly as my daughter fainted, and she looked down. That wasn't Haley's sensitivity. To be honest, I asked. I didn't need my voice to elevate. I didn't come to fight, so why did you come? She exhaled sharply, shifting abruptly, uncertain of her position. Believed that you could be open to making a statement, or speaking to the media to explain that we didn't complete. I paused. You want me to issue a press release? I replied. I understand your role. Barbara bent somewhat urgently, rising beneath her mask, slowly to clean up your discomfort. It wasn't a lie. Context. People are increasingly asking questions, and we have always valued caution. Regarding the wedding and Haley's remarks that she was hesitant around us, I gave. You know how these things spread. A few sounds at her. She continued more quickly now. Bites, and all of a sudden there's a scandal. Haley's profession, and our family's reputation could be viewed incorrectly. You want me to laugh? I nearly laughed, but it sounded like breath on glass. Help maintain the illusion, I repeated. Barbara's expression somewhat stiffened. Degree. No. I responded quietly, but firmly. I was defending the family. You did preserve the family. You deleted a daughter. She turned aside as silence descended between us like dust on ancient furniture, blinking more quickly than normal. Do you know? I went on to discuss what it's like to see your own mother act as though you don't exist. To have your own lineage airbrushed out of you. Her fingers tightened over the cup's edge, and I saw it. Shuddered a little. The first break, I made decisions, she continued. Her voice finally low? I never stopped caring, even though some of them were flawed. Barbara's chin raised as if she were repositioning herself, and she stopped calling. If you told us I did, you just didn't want to listen. You wanted a little smiling daughter. She opened her mouth, then shut it, once more. This time, the quiet was exposed rather than resistant. Then she grabbed for my hand in a way I hadn't seen since I was 10, was hesitant, her fingers lingering just above the table, as if time would stop if she touched me. She claimed she never intended to harm me, but people allow things to happen. They whisper and let the knife fall on its own, as if Haley doesn't need to stab. We met at the cafe just past the hotel lobby, the type intended for expensive tea and courteous silences. Through large windows, morning light flowed in, casting a gentle, confusing radiance that makes. A few visitors remained with laptops and cappuccinos, making reality seem less solid. Nobody paid attention to us. Haley showed there 10 minutes late, still wearing sunglasses. Her hair pulled into a low chignon that shouted, I'm composed, even as her hands betrayed me, despite the inside lights. The twitch of nerves. She sat across from me into the booth and sent me a smile that looked like it was plastered on. She cleared her throat and exhaled. Well, which was theatrical. I remained silent. Look, I went too far last night. It was merely a joke. The gate guard. To be honest, I didn't believe that was the. She blinked behind her glasses. You never think you script. I interjected, folding my hands on the table. I apologize. I took out a thick, slightly crumpled sheet of paper from my leather folio, bearing the. A redacted sender appears at the top, followed by the official watermark of the Department of the Army's Public Affairs section. Bottom. A 7-year-old timestamp. Haley cocked her head in amusement. What is this meant to be? A stipend? I replied, and I was accused of lying by a military whistleblower hotline. Deployment specifics, claiming that my Bronze Star was political and that I overstated my participation in Helmand. I've never seen that. Of course you did. Haley's smile went cold. Had, I said coolly. You authored it? That's ridiculous. She sneered. I pushed another document across the table, this one from an AI language study. It was anonymous, and anyone could have sent it. 96% of the documents in the military's document authentication program match, I said. Density as well as an additional irrelevant factor that is not said by anyone with clearance. However, did in school essays as well. She remained silent. 2 months prior to me being passed over for my first job, you sent this. Elevation to the rank of Brigadier General. I didn't know why. No official fees. Simple. Quiet. My file was inactive for about a year. Haley moved around in her chair. I was. Finally, she said. Angry, you were always Dad's pride, the soldier and the star. We were all compared. All I wanted was room to breathe. You attempted to bury me alive. I stopped her from protesting even though she opened her mouth. You, I answered, destroyed me so you could shine brighter. You forget that I burn though. I mistook him for the groom. As it is, he has been bearing the weight of my silence like a burden. The bar on the rooftop was almost deserted. It's the sort of environment where private anguish is covered up as quiet conversation. Some customers were nursing drinks in the corners. Far below, the city lights flashed like unfulfilled promises. My jacket's hem was softly pulled by the breeze. I didn't see. Andrew was already there, leaning against the railing, half drunk on an amber glass. He didn't glance, as though a man had just said, I do. He appeared to be a man who had realized his mistake. He said, I didn't think you'd come. Without turning. You inquired? I answered. Slowly. He nodded. Didn't intend for you to see. Indeed. At last I took a step forward. He appeared older than I had recalled. Not within his face but his posture. Less armored and more exhausted. You wish to discuss Hellbent? I inquired. You saved my life? He asked, turning to face me. That's old news. Not to me. There was a long silence between us. The type that's neither cozy. I said, she doesn't know, does she? But she wasn't hostile, just full. He shook his head. I kept the minefield and what you did from Haley. She would twist it. I knew. Make it into a fable. About how she supported her husband when he almost died while serving. She uses stories as weapons. You deserved it. Better. I didn't respond. He turned his gaze back to the street. I kept a close eye on your career. With each advancement, each speech. When you received the second star, I clipped the article. Nobody was aware. Why? Since I owed you. Additionally, I held you in the highest regard of anyone I'd ever met. I inhaled deeply. So why get married to her? He remained silent for a while. Afterward, because she was simple, due to the fact that the Coles provided a life that felt cleaned and organized. I had had enough of nearly dying. I desired safety. She is not secure. She has a plan. He chuckled quietly. Yes. About a week after the engagement, I realized it out. Observed him for a while. She sent in the tip. Don't you think? My first star was stalled by that one. He shut his eyes. I didn't want to be certain, but I always had a suspicion. Yes, I am. He held onto the railing more forcefully, whitening knuckles. He claimed that if I didn't get up last night, I would end up becoming one of them. Stared at me, then looked closely, and for a split second, I saw the guy I had dug out of the ground, burdened but not broken. Didn't express gratitude. Don't ever let my name protect yours again. I just responded to their attempt to define me. Murmurs. I made the decision to talk loud enough to be heard. Reagan National had a constant scent, like coffee in haste, gate cries, rolling wheels, and the chatter of people attempting to be somewhere else. Airports were nice. They simply checked without asking any questions. IDs, and went on. I arrived at my flight in civilian clothes 20 minutes early. Duffels with loose hair hung over one shoulder. I didn't want to be noticed. I ought to have been more aware. I had almost reached the TSA checkpoint midway. The initial flash triggered. Then another. Next came the abrupt overlap of the voice. Inevitable. Can you remark on the wedding incident, General Cole? Did you know the bride would create that, ma'am? Assertion? The groom was under your direction. Is that correct? I took a moment to take a breath. All they needed was that. I was abruptly encircled by a loose semicircle of iPhones, microphones, and two eager faces attempting to strike a balance between respect and curiosity. A safe. I held up a hand before the cop moved forward. Not yet, not yet. I noticed old travel pamphlets and a podium over to the side. One of those shoddy arrangements by the flag. I moved in its direction. At first no one followed, as if they weren't sure if I was going to speak or blow out. They fell silent almost immediately when I looked at them. I understand why you're here, I started, and I am aware of your desires. A statement, a response, a headline, or something that can cut soft, sufficient to sell. They bided their time. One by one, I looked them in the eye. My family does not own me. Failed, I replied. Even their quiet was made visible. The room moved, the media blinked, and nobody was. I went on. I served my country while being written out of my own story, even though they had been listening to me type for years. Despite being told that I had tarnished the family name, I wore a uniform. My rank was gained by blood, not by popularity. Someone muttered, "Damn." I took out one sheet from my jacket, the mission brief still warm from the printer this morning. I announced today that I'm starting the Resilience Foundation, a support network and legal assistance for military members whose careers have been harmed by family members, personal betrayals, spouses, even friends, as the most profound wounds can occasionally originate from people who declare their love for us. A pause, followed by the sound of cameras clicking once more. "Is about visibility, not retaliation," I replied. "We see you if you've been disowned, gaslit, marginalized, or erased." The first hand went up, a reporter near the rear. I nodded. "General, are you saying that you still serve and that you still matter? You're free to make your own connections. I've already done it. Your family ruined your career?" I shrugged. Connected mine. There was still no mayhem despite additional whispers and scrawled notes. Simply gravity. A youthful cadet, no older than 19, stepped forward. From the crowd's periphery, his sharp, anxious uniform made him stand at attention. He saluted, and I did the same. We exchanged words, but they weren't necessary. My phone vibrated in my pocket as I turned to head for the gate. "We need to talk," they wrote boldly across the top of the Pentagon. The Pentagon briefing room was colder than I remembered, not in the way they had anticipated. They never thought I would become policy temperature, but in spirit temperature. Navy blue carpeting, polished wood trim, and the shimmer of American symbols. Power didn't exist there, and judgments were made with tighter grins and tighter language. It already reverberated in every corner, so it didn't need to raise its voice. I stood behind a steel lectern with my hands resting. The presentation screen behind me gleamed, softly on either side, breath even. Under the straightforward heading of Resilience Protection Protocol, rows of brass and the seats in front of me were occupied by suits, civilian policy advisors, analysts, and Admiral Kitchener, a guy with silver bars and a doubtful scowl at the end of the first row. Type of man who, despite a woman raising her voice, claimed to be emotional, yet referred to a male cop as passionate for. I started by doing the same. This procedure resolves an unsaid rift in our officers and enlisted staff who are personally betrayed by their spouse's family or internal. Reputations are damaged, careers stagnate, and networks frequently suffer in silence. System shrugs. Betrayal, not combat, is the reason we lose soldiers. Slide 1. Slide 2. Internal complaints were never raised. Slide 3. Retention data. Trends in suicidality linked to character defamation. At the moment, our reaction is reactionary at best. The three-tiered protection approach I've proposed is lawful. Representation, career protection, and psychological support, all of which are started as soon as a breach is confirmed. We're muttering now primarily from the civilian liaison who was taking notes and nodding. Admiral Kitchener, respectfully, the brass held their arms crossed. One hand lifted. He continued, "General Cole, this sounds more personal than structural." I gave him a small smile, not icy, but precise. The room fell still as I added, "Policy is personal, or it's propaganda." I used the silence to my advantage, rather than as a weapon. But as gravity, we have procedures for combat loss and war damage, so I didn't feel the need to fill it out right then. However, what about people we're taught are secure betraying us? When your mother divulges your record, when your sister, these are not tabloid issues. When a partner betrays your confidence for attention, it anonymously ruins your clearance. A younger colonel, in the rear, typed frantically on his iPad, indicating that these are operational risks. A civilian. Kitchener remained silent as the analyst leaned closer and nodded. I closed, presented with just one sentence. "We teach our people how to endure in times of conflict." I took a step back once we instructed the institution to protect them from peace. Power rooms aren't like that. The room didn't clap or erupt. However, "We'll fund it," the Undersecretary of Defense replied calmly as he leaned in and folded his palms on the table. That was sufficient. They used to say I was the disgrace of the Cole family. That was everything, so I dropped the name but retained lessons. The hydrangeas and daffodils along the walkway were in full flower in the front yard, exploding as though they had. It was smaller than I remembered, but it was the same, something to prove. Less intimidating. Barbara had always taken delight in her well-kept lawn, which served as a metaphor for control and order. I saw the drapes from the living room move as I stood at its edge. Window. She had anticipated my arrival. Barbara wasn't wearing her pearls, a pastel cardigan, a top with buttons, and no lipstick. Didn't match. Her hair had gotten thinner and was pushed back into a... I didn't smile, but she tried to be a bun, but I didn't hold. "Come in," she remarked. Perhaps it was age, recollection, or the attempt, but her voice had lost its edge. The house smelled like lemon polish as usual, but below it was something that was the result of keeping so many lies straight. We just went to the front room, 2 other rooms, and a hollows, as if the walls had given up attempting to conceal secrets. Chairs, tea, and pretense. Barbara took a seat first, and I stood until I was... She stared up at me as if I may melt, folded her hands in her lap, and was certain I wanted to be here. Before her. "You were noisy in a world that didn't know how to protect you without eliminating you," she finally concluded. "Punished loud ladies," I said. I wasn't loud, I was visible. Difference. Her fingers trembled slightly, revealing the serenity she had fought so hard to convey. She looked down. She went on. "I believe that if we separated you, people would forget. The scandal would subside. You may still have a life somewhere else." I answered. "You made me, not erased me." Memorable. After a pause that seemed to go on forever, like a canyon between us, there was a gentle creak from the... Haley was standing halfway down the stairs, barefoot, with a loose-fitting robe around her waist. She looked directly into my eyes and remained silent. Barbara, who has changed since the wedding, didn't see anything, and she didn't have to... Anything, I said. I had to live. Barbara swallowed. She had to just be... Difficult. What can I do right now? Yes, I replied. Don't change my tale. If someone wonders why I don't return home, don't tell them. She blinked after I left. Tell them you made a decision, and they did the same. If they inquire about what transpired, don't suggest it was difficult. Barbara grabbed for what might have been a hand or a previous iteration of herself. But I responded, "I have a flight," and Haley remained motionless. Her hold on... I moved to the door, but my boots didn't stay solid on the banister. It's funny how time erases, and what it won't touch can reverberate like they used to on this floor. I walked out without giving them a hug. I didn't slam the door on her, but that was also a decision. Legacy is what they say happens after you're gone, and reputation... The fluorescent lights above, the mismatched folding chairs, some of which wobbled, and what's left after they're quiet, buzzed softly, illuminating the space with a gentle, egalitarian glow. There was no hierarchy or position here, just people. The community center smelled of burnt coffee and resolve, bruised, even a bit bent, but unbreakable. I stood at the front sleeves and rolled them just enough to demonstrate that I liked it. The resilience wasn't here as a general, but I didn't forget I ever was. Behind me, the foundation flag hung crookedly, with old tape pulling down the edges. However, the printed message was clear. We empower the injured, not erase them. About 30 people had arrived, some in normal clothing, others in uniform, and one woman had a name tag that just... I cleared my throat and read, "Vi. You are not what they said you are," I said. "You're not theatrical, unstable, or overly challenging. As witnesses, you are. And stop embarrassing witnesses. We teach kids to be leaders." A brief silence was followed by a few nods. A young lady, my sister, who was around 17, raised her hand in the second row. She was calm. She claimed to have been released last year because she was too emotional for the unit, according to her coworker. Her voice broke on the final line, as she attempted to report harassment and discovered that she had a psychological vow on her record. Word, she gulped rapidly, adding, "I still have the letters, but no one will take her case." I moved cautiously forward and said, "Bring them to us." She breathed so profoundly that I realized she hadn't been breathing. "So I'll let you handle it from here." Someone in the back. I didn't care. Let them film with their phone. This wasn't a secrecy. Quite the reverse. A 50-year-old man, formerly in the military, stood erect beside the stance. Judging by the silence in his face, my son was now a civilian. When he resisted, they labeled him unstable and ordered him to quit if he couldn't man up. He grinned, for the first time in months during his speech at the Pentagon, saying, "Maybe they're finally listening." Nodded once. Just enough. No flourish. Tell him I told him he wasn't mistaken. There was an unadulterated buzz in the room. Not cheers, not enthusiasm, just recognition, and that's when someone's phone rang with a notice. The video became viral, receiving 20,000 views, followed by 50 headlines, and Major General Cole's continued service without. I looked at the television and then back to the room, saluting anyone. Let them observe. Let them finally realize who I've always been. They never expressed regret. However, since my name is heavier than theirs, they now utter it carefully. The National Defense Symposium Hall throbbed. With a subdued intensity, rows of chairs extended back into a sea of lived experience in uniform suits. Cameras circled, eager to capture something. Survivors sitting next to senators, veterans sitting next to policy wonks. Real. I didn't bring notes. The stage was simple, with a solitary flag behind me and a lesson in a glass of water. I had not witnessed Barbara's arrival, but I had been informed that she was coming and that she insisted on being there. Seated in the front, because she hadn't brought Haley. I took the microphone. The silence that ensued wasn't. It was the type of procedure that was only given to those who had walked through fire and turned it into fog. I was one, informed that blood is thicker than water. I started off as though it were consoling. It was less painful to sink in blood. A ripple went through the crowd. Families, continued, are meant to shield and protect, but occasionally they target. Quiet. Occasionally the betrayal comes not from an enemy in another country, but rather I've discovered that the air tightens around the person who shares your dinner table, your last name and the wall of your childhood bedroom. That the most dangerous betrayal is quiet, courteous, and accompanied by silence at funerals and smiles at weddings. I paused long enough, and I vanished for years. It's disguised as loyalty, but it demands your disappearance. I was punished for speaking when they wanted me to keep quiet, not because I was ashamed, but because I refused to be the. There were a few nods and gasps, and I realized Barbara was the story they needed to survive. She had been practicing stillness for so long that even her tears would be silent now. I gazed at the sea of faces, young, old, and not in uniform, that had arrived for policy, but to be allowed to be loud, conspicuous, and outraged. Concludes today, I stated. I am collaborating with legislators to provide federal safeguards for individuals who have been deceived, not by within the system. A bill acknowledging that sabotage doesn't always arrive from the outside. That family is still dangerous even if they are weaponized. I said, I was once their secret, but now I am their sentence. Stepping back from the microphone just enough to allow the room to catch up. As I left the stage, a communal letting go of something too long caused the room to exhale rather than erupt. Near the curtain, I was spotted by a young reporter. Would you ever return to them? I didn't hesitate, she asked. It was sufficient that I never left myself, I said. I lived for attention once. I now know how to view myself clearly and without consent. The sea air slipped through the shutters, making a faint creaking sound. Through them, bearing the aroma of lemons and salt. The cottage's stone floor was flooded with afternoon sunshine. The waves below murmured against the Amalfi cliffs, as though the shoreline itself were warming everything it touched. Was letting go. I had spent the entire morning painting, nothing spectacular, just simple brushstrokes on canvas. The easel stood close to the window facing the horizon, the unfinished sky waiting, color where there had been only shade. Slowly, I didn't hurry, no command briefings, no schedule, no deadlines, just the sound of the waves and the pages of a leather-bound journal, gradually revealing fragments of who I had no idea that I had lost. Just after 4 o'clock, Luca, the boy, the 10-year-old villager, carrying a basket filled with bread, olives, and a folded newspaper that I hadn't requested, grinning, was unable to control his interest and gaped. Grazie, I replied, taking the PGO, he said, getting up. Basket. Sura, were you truly a general? He hesitated, then grinned. I used to be someone who stood up for herself, but now I'm simply that. Appeared content with it, and left before I could continue. Once I was back inside, the ancient army-issued device, which I had pigeonly kept in a drawer that now contained faded paper, buzzed. I never showed the medals and lanyards. General Simmons left a voicemail. Rebecca, he stated in a tone measured, if you're agreeable, you would serve as the chair of the Joint Ethics Board, which the President's office wishes to nominate you to. Consider this. I listened to it once before deleting it. Knowing that you are no longer responsible for your tale gives you a certain sense of freedom. The journal was open to the last page, and I sat at the writing desk, open to anybody. After the ink dried, I strolled alone, but not lost, dipped the pen, held it motionless for a moment, and wrote the final line. In the amber light, slowly, I shut the journal, and secured it in the drawer with. I stood, pushed open the patio doors, and went out after putting everything else I didn't need on my chest. Outside, the wind seized strands of the air and it embraced me like an old friend. Of my hair and tossed them in the direction of the light. Below, the ocean opened up and everlasting. Just the sound of a woman who once disappeared without any headlines or praise. Figuring out how to go back to herself, not to them. After a lifetime of being silenced, the family that had shunned her let the truth speak for her, and she didn't need a microphone to be heard. Shuddered at the mention of her name, now, not out of embarrassment, but out of power. Justice failed to arrive. Retribution, but via presence. Consistent, unwavering, and merited. Similar to the last chord of a song that has been forgotten. Justice may come late, but once it is heard, it has a strong resonance. Please type 1 if you felt seen, type 2 if the tale touched you, like, share, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. You still require additional responses.